So there are our two cams. You've got intake 1 and 2, exhaust 1 and 2, and same thing on the other. The next thing you're going to need access to is this sight window for looking at your timing, and then we got to be able to rotate the crankshaft, so this has got to come off. Okay, that's 10 millimeter hex. That is 8 millimeter hex. So get those two off next. Simple cover, got an O-ring, careful. No O-ring here, but a crush washer like you would find on a drain plug. So keep an eye on that. I'm going to go put these someplace safe. Okay, for turning the crankshaft you need a 17 millimeter socket. I am using a deep well just to give me a little reach, although I don't think deep well is necessary. And set your ratchet to loosening and leave it there, because you only want to turn this crankshaft clockwise. Excuse me, counterclockwise. So sorry. Okay, we got the covers off. We're into the cams and the valve tappets themselves, and it's time to start taking those measurements. The acceptable range for intake differs from exhaust. You want to be on intake valves, the distance between the cam lobe, and they have to be in a particular position, and I'll show that. And that's why we have that cover open so we can rotate the crankshaft. Is we got to look at the timing and make sure we've got the cam lobes in the right position when we're taking the measurement. But that distance between the cam lobes and the tappet have got to be on the intake 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters, and on the exhaust 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. And so you need feeler gauges, which now with my new toolbox, I don't remember what drawer I put those in. I'll find my feeler gauges. And we're going to dive into that. So I'll show here from the shop manual, service manual, how to position those cam lobes, and also it shows a timing mark. On the front it'll be FT, and on the rear I believe it's RT. I'll take a look at that. Get those lobes in the right position, and we'll put in our feeler gauges. So here we go with actually checking the clearance. I don't know if you can see that, but FT is centered in that timing viewing hole. But here's the problem. You can see that those cam lobes are in the wrong position. They are not in the A or B position at this current time. So I have to rotate that crank again around to the FT, and those cam lobes will be in a different position, because right now I think we're at bottom dead center. Okay, now I've got my mark back to FT. Again, I went around a full revolution, and now you can see that those cam lobes are in the, I can't remember if that's the A or the B position, but it's the correct position for measuring. Okay, so I've got my old measurements here in my journal. I'm going to go ahead and start a new page. Maybe I'll do them on the back of this page just to keep them together. But at the top, valve tappet clearance and check, the mileage at the time, and the date. And so I'm going to have measured clearance, and then the measured shim size. So when I pull the shim out, I actually can measure the size of it and know what's in there, and then after adjustment what my measurements were. So I've got what I need for shims, and we're going to start collecting that information here. Okay, so the first one I'm going to try is on my intake side. My minimum here is 0.1 millimeters, so I've got a 0.1 millimeter feeler gauge, and I slide that between the cam lobe and the tappet, and it fits just fine. So I'm certainly larger than that. So let's go up one step. Sorry. And here is my 0.2, which would be the upper end of the limit. And that does not fit. So we are somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2. Now what I can do is I can take my feeler gauge and do the 0.1 and then add like 0.038 to it, so I'm really at 0.1, just call it 0.14 with the two of these together. Okay, that fits. So I'm pretty good there. I've also got a 0.5, so this would make it just slightly thicker. 0.15 does not fit in. So my measurement is 0.14 millimeters. So that was left-hand side, front, 0.14 millimeters. Okay, so now on the other intake side, I'm going to try to get my 0.1 under here. And this one is a little harder to see if I'm lining up correctly, but yeah, I'm fine with 0.1. Let's do 0.14. Actually, I'm just going to go right to 0.15 because I've got it. Well, there is a 1.27 here I can use. And that's fitting. Here I've got a 1.52. I'm sorry, 0.152. 0.152 is fitting well. Yeah, 0.178 is the next one. The oil is making these stick together. Okay, so 0.178 will not go in, but 0.152 does. So I'm going to go with 0.152 as my measurement. 0.152 millimeters. I'm putting millimeters because inches is also an option here, and I have to remember what I used. Okay, now on the exhaust side, the bottom end of acceptable range is 0.2 millimeters, so I'm going to start there. Ooh, and that fits, but it's snug. So I'm going to call that 0.2. I am at the bottom end of the range on that valve. So that was left-hand exhaust, 0.0203 millimeter. That I'm going to circle as right at the minimum. So that one's got my attention. I'm not going to be able to ride this motorcycle at that low range for another 15,000 miles. That's going to need adjustment. And same thing on the other side. 0.2. That fit pretty loosely. Step up 1. 0.23. That fit, but snug. What's next? 0.25. Oh, that fit, but snug. Next is 0.279. That's almost 0.8 or 0.28. That does not fit. So I'm going to say 0.25. 0.25 millimeter. That is smack dab in the middle of the acceptable range. I'm leaving that alone. So we're almost middle, getting a little lower. Might consider
changing that shim. We'll have to do the math with what's available in shims and see if the next size up would put us oversize. And these guys are smack dab in the middle. But this guy is at the bottom end of acceptable. Got to change that. Now I'm going from FT in the timing mark to RT. There. RT is showing in the timing. Now I check my cam position. Let me pick this up. And the cam position is the B position. I'll come around here. So that is, the B position, if you can see that, with the two top lobes kind of pointing up to, from this angle, call it 11 o'clock, about 10:30. So that is a okay position to do your measurement in. And I'm not going to show measuring all four of those again. It's the exact same procedure as I did on the front, but just do all four of the two intake and the two exhaust and write them in the logbook same way. Okay, so here are all of my measurements. Front and rear, intake and exhaust, left and right. This is within the spec. This is in the middle of the range, you know, both of them. This is getting a little under halfway toward the bottom end of the spec, but it's okay. This is midway. This is midway. Or I'm sorry, this one is right at the bottom. So that one we're going to want to change for sure. And then middle of the spec, middle of the spec. This is actually toward the upper end. So nothing really to do here with the rear. This is the guy that jumps out, where, you know, I don't want to go another 15,000 miles without doing something about this. And since I'm in here, I may want to do something about this one also. But if I leave it, I'm probably going to be okay with it. If I leave it, what I'm not going to do is go over 15,000 miles before the next time I check it. So that's why a journal is good to know, because months from now I'll forget, you know, did I have one that was, you know, one to keep my eye on or not? Here it is. And that will help me make a decision down the road months from now on, hey, is it urgent that I do this? Or maybe could I put it off another 2,000-3,000 miles because it's not convenient for my life right now. That helps make those kinds of decisions. So now the next thing we got to do, in order to make an adjustment here, I got to know what size shim is in that position. These others I can just leave them. That's what I'm going to do. So this guy, I have to measure the shim, and in order to raise it up from what it is to where I want to be, if that makes sense. So we'll pull that out, and to do that I have to pull out the camshaft, and so that's next.
Real quickly, here are some interesting insights before I take that cam off. Because I keep a journal, I can look back at the last time I did the valve clearance adjustment, and that front left-hand exhaust valve was toward its lower end of its limit, and so I did adjust the shim. I went from a 2.9 millimeter to a 2.85. So I've already adjusted that once. This was the measured shim. It was a 2.9 that was in there, and after adjustment, problem is I used inches last time I did this instead of metric, so there's some conversion. But anyways, I went from 8 thousandths to 9 thousandths, and I am likely going to find that there's a 2.85 in there now. So here's the insights. One, I know what's in there now, so I can probably already do the math and order up the correct shim to adjust to get this gap back up closer to 0.3 millimeters. And I don't have to necessarily take the bike apart to do that. Take the cam out to do that. And the other thing I'm noticing is that, you know, that needed adjustment before, so why is that particular valve wearing so much faster than the others. I mean, here we've got intake, no adjustment was needed at all. Here on the intake, no adjustment was needed. And that makes sense that intake valves would not wear as fast as exhaust valves. They don't have as much heat going past them, past the seats. But why is this one exhaust valve going a little bit quicker than the other? I can't answer that here, but it's got my attention. Anyways, we're not making major adjustments here. If I keep this up, I will get many, many, many thousands of miles out of this engine. So, not too concerned about it, but it's a curious thing. Okay, so before I take this cam out, this is the one I'll be taking out, I've put the front cylinder to top dead center again by bringing up the FT mark in the viewing window for timing, and I've got my lobes in that A position again, and what I end up with is two little marks that you probably will never see on this camera. But let me put this in my mouth for a second. Here. Here. There are lines on the end of that cam that are lined up parallel with the top of the head, and it's on both of them. I'm going to put up a picture right here of what that looks like, but because it's better in the service manual. But that's the position you got to be in before you start loosening these bolts here that allow the cam to come out. So get it lined up, then we can loosen those 10mm bolts. Okay, so this is our exhaust, which is easily labeled EX. And I'm going to go ahead and start loosening these, going opposing from each other. And just a little at a time at first. Alright, and we can just take these all the way out. And the last one is loose. All four are now loose. I'm just going to pull these screws out so I'm not rattling them around too much. There's no room to swing a hammer around in here. It's definitely loose. There, I'm getting some action on it. Not much though. Need a different kind of hammer. Something with a smaller head. I've got this dead blow that's got a little bit smaller head. Yeah, that's what I needed. There. Just gotta get it loose. Come on. It's coming. There. That's off. Keep these parts clean. We've got a clean spot over on the bench that I'll put them. And I'll take out the cam. Now, getting this bucket out of here is kind of difficult with your fingers, but if you just get a magnetic tool like this, it's real slick. You can just slide it out, and inside here is my Tappet shim. Is that little guy in there. And I'll pull him out. There. That's my shim. So these are the things that you replace, and what I'll do is get a slightly thinner by maybe
5/100ths, or even maybe even a full hundredth, full tenth, I'm sorry. No, not a tenth. 10/100ths, 5/100ths to 10/100ths, and that will then increase by shortening this, means this bucket will go further down toward the valve by that amount, the difference between this shim and the new one, and increase the gap between the lobe and it. And there's my clearance adjusted back up to spec. Okay, so I get out my caliper measuring, and I've got my old shim. Just about drop it. And put this guy in there. Let me get around the camera here. And I've got it set to millimeters. Slide this open. Measure that guy. 2.83. Wow, that's a 2.85. That's just a little bit of error on this thing. So 2.85 is what's in there. That is what my records show that I put in there. And so I'm going to have to adjust that to a little bit thinner to increase the clearance between my cam lobe and that Tappet bucket. So let me go on to eBay and find out what the next step down is. I assume that it's a 2.80, and then there'll be a 2.75. So let's do the math and see if it can handle a 2.75. That would increase our gap quite a bit and be a long time before we need to adjust that one again. Stay tuned. We'll see what I can find. And on to eBay to order a shim. Be careful if you're going to order through, one, you can find them at your local dealer sometimes. Oddly enough, my local Suzuki dealer does not stock a set of shims for this thing. I just think that's crazy, but because I've got the engine apart, and this means I got to drive my car to work all week. Big thumbs down on driving the car to work, especially in Los Angeles. If you asked me to live in Los Angeles without a motorcycle, I'd say I'm moving. Anyways, make sure that where you're buying the shim from on eBay is within the United States, and just look into how long it's going to take to get there. I want it here by next weekend, so I'm going to make sure that I'm ordering from some seller who's stateside, and preferably on the west side of the country. You know, maybe a few cents or even $1 more just to get one here in time. Hey, that's well worth it to me to stay out of that car. So here we go, new shim coming. And one more thought on ordering shims. I only need one shim this time around, but if you need multiples, then make sure you measure all the shims you have. One of the shims that you're taking out of a Tappet that needs adjustment might just be the one you need for another one to get that one within spec. So you know, it didn't work out this way, that I don't get to show you that. I only need one shim, and that's a good thing. But if you need multiples, sometimes you already have it. So keep track of what you've got. Okay, so I've got the shim on order off eBay. It says it should be here by next Saturday. Well, let's hope so. I'd like Saturday morning, please. We've now had this rear open. We've done our checks, and this turns out to be just an inspection and not an adjustment on this one. So we can button this back up. Here's how we're going to do that. So you will recall that the rear, two ways to identify that. One, it says rear inside here, but also it's the cover that has the camshaft position sensor on it. The front one does not have that. You'll notice that there's a little piece of metal that rotates. It's just a kind of a dowel or a pin that rotates on this cam. So we've adjusted nothing, we've taken nothing apart. This can literally be slapped back down on and torqued down to the proper torque spec. But I do need to put RTV silicone here, and the old stuff is still on this gasket. We want to just get all of that off. So let's get this cleaned up,
and we'll get some fresh RTV down in that spot. And what we don't want to do is lose these little pieces of RTV silicone down inside the engine. Not that they'll do any damage to gears, but they can clog oil passages, and then if oil is not flowing, you got a problem. And this is what I like to use. In every way, this seems to be like Suzuki Bond or Honda Bond or Yamaha Bond, and it's a lot cheaper. Works great. It's oil resistant. Okay, so I've first checked down here that I don't have any globs of the old silicone sealant, the gasket sealer, down in these half moons, and that's really the only place that we need the gasket sealer, is in those half moons. The rest of the way the rubber does fine. And what I've done is put a little bit of the RTV just in here on those half moons, and I smoothed it out with a screwdriver. So making sure my gasket is perfectly in place, that this O-ring is here, that O-ring is still around that dowel, and I can carefully get this past the wiring. The tough spot is right here. You're deep down within the frame, and you don't want to get a bunch of this RTV all over those cam gears. So make yourself some room. And I'm going to get my head in the way, but I want to make sure I'm doing this right. There, and I've got it pressed down on. Everything's lined up nicely. There, now I just get my 4 bolts out and torque them down. Let me go grab the correct torque spec. Remember, you have to have those rubber seals there on the back of these bolts. Don't lose those, or you'll be leaking oil, and you won't get the right you probably won't be able to torque it down, because this doesn't have threads all the way up, so that distance needs to be held by something. You'd be quite loose without it. The torque spec is 10 pound-feet or 14 Newton meters. So where is my 10 pound-feet? Here we go. Right there. Not very many twists on this 3/8 inch torque wrench. So another thing I'm going to do while I'm in here is, doesn't get any easier than right now to check my air cleaner element. Replaced this a while ago, and with this, there's so much surface area on these things that you can take them out, you can blow them clean, but you don't want to go doing that on and on and on forever. So I'll open that up and clean that out, and then once I'm starting to button things back up next weekend, I'm going to go ahead and do another throttle body adjustment, because I'm in here and I've got these lines that I had hooked up to the nipples on the throttle bodies some time ago, and so that I can more easily access. So I've got one here for the front and one for the rear, and makes that job a lot easier. You can keep the fuel tank on and just be working from the side with a long needle nose to make the adjustment. I need a couple vacuum gauges. I have a video on it, so go check that out. Maybe I'll put a link below on this particular video for that. And so that's a couple other things I'm going to do while I'm in here. And finally, before I hook things up here, is put a brand new spark plug in. Before I do, I'm going to put some anti-seize lubricant on the threads, just a little bit. Makes it easy to get off the next time. You don't want just gobs of this, because it can get around inside of there, especially because of the reach I've got to do here. But just a little some to make it come out next time easier. So it dawned on me that there's really 2 different audiences that are watching these videos. One, there's those of you that are following along every week, and to you, I want to provide that content each week so that the stays interesting, and that's how I like to watch and stay engaged with people that I subscribe to. So for you, I'm going to go ahead and publish at this point, and
this will be the end of these videos. I may break this up into 2 parts, but they'll come out at the same time. But we're still mid-project because we're waiting for that shim to come in. Then there's the other group that see this long after it's been published, and they're just searching how to do a valve clearance adjustment on a V-Strom, and they want to see the whole job. So for those of you, the next part should be right there, and we'll just do these part 1, 2, possibly 3. Maybe it's just part 1 and 2, but I got to see when I get to editing how long all of this is. But I want to thank you for joining me. We've pretty much shown the whole project, although there is a couple of details to when you're putting a new shim in and putting that camshaft back in. So be sure to watch that video if you're doing this job on your own bike. That should be, well, they said it will arrive by Saturday, so 1 week from now we'll be able to get that video up. So thanks for watching. Be sure to click like if you like this video, and please subscribe to follow along. The other thing I'll mention is I'm still moving ahead with the Cafe Racer project on the Suzuki GS550. While I've been doing this shim adjustment, I've been putting the final clear coat on the head, and so with that project we should soon be getting into putting the valves back in, and we'll be doing another valve adjustment project, and that one is probably going to need a lot of different shims because I did some what do you call it, my mind is blank, valve lapping, and so that'll change the clearances from what they were in that engine, and some of them were out from the beginning. If you've been following along and go way back to when I was taking it apart, we were out of spec on a couple of those anyway, so we've got a lot of valve adjustments to do there. For those of you who have an inline 4, you don't take the camshafts out when you do a valve job on those, tappet clearance adjustment. There's a special tool to give you enough room to pull those shims out. So watch that series when I'm done with it. So we've got 2 different types of engines and 2 different valve clearance adjustments coming up pretty close to each other. So again, subscribe, click like. Thanks for watching.